a Ukrainian official reported that the Russian offensive in Kharkov region already underway. Do you think that Russia is going to expand the front line? Then they're going to go to the from Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk, and going up there to Kharkov? And how do you see the situation on the battlefield right now?
Russia is going to impose its will on Ukraine and on Ukraine's Western allies. Russia has always made it clear that not only will it regain control of the totality of Kherson, including the right bank, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk, but that Russia is going to seek to have a buffer zone. And if Ukraine isn't going to willingly hand over the territory necessary to create this buffer zone, Russia will seize it through military force. This is what Russia has said all along. They warned Ukraine, when you start using long-range weapons to strike Russian territory, all you're doing is guaranteeing that the buffer zone that we're going to create is going to be even bigger. And this is why demilitarization is so important too. It's not just about the size of the Ukrainian military that will be permitted in a post-conflict environment, but the composition of this military, what weapons it will have. Ukraine will not be allowed to have any weapons capable of striking Russian territory. Ukraine lost that right. It started this conflict. It sought to escalate this conflict, and now it's lost this conflict. And that's just the way the cookie crumbles.
It seems the timeline on the part of the United States, Donald Trump wants to put an end as soon as possible. Russia doesn't see that they can get what they want from a Ukrainian settlement during a short period of time. What is the main concern on the part of Russia that they really believe that it would take time to achieve that?
There's no concern on the part of Russia. Russia's not concerned by any of this. Russia doesn't care. Russia didn't ask for this. It's not Russia that went to the United States and says, please intercede because we're in a tough position right here and we really need your help to bring an end to this conflict, and we're willing to do whatever's necessary to make that happen. Russia never said that. Trump said, I want this war to end. Why? Because America's lost this war. That's the reality. Trump wants to spin it. This is Joe Biden's war. It's not Joe Biden's war. It's Donald Trump's war. I want to remind everybody that Trump was president from 2017 to 2000 and the beginning of 2021, during which time the United States was actively training Ukrainian forces for the purpose of fighting the Russians. The U.S. Army has a slide that brags about training a battalion's worth of Ukrainian forces to NATO standards here, pointing to Western Ukraine, drawing an arrow so they could go fight the Russians over here. That's during Donald Trump's presidency. He provided the offensive weapons, the javelins and the stingers. This is Donald Trump's war. He was president when the CIA created 20 plus bases inside Ukraine to carry out espionage and other covert operations designed to bring down Russia. He knows what the objectives were during his presidency, which was to bring about the strategic defeat of Vladimir Putin's regime. Regime change was the policy of the United States during Donald Trump's presidency. Joe Biden didn't invent this. He just inherited it and continued it. So Trump is trying to disassociate himself from failed policy. He doesn't want to be the commander in chief when the whole thing collapses. He wants to create a scenario which allows him to say, I brought peace where Joe Biden only brought war. Trump says that this war would never have happened had he been president. I don't agree with that statement because Trump doesn't have the diplomatic skill set necessary to finesse this, especially when everything that Ukraine did in terms of aggressive posturing towards Russia were things that were agreed to when Trump was president. This is Trump's war, and Russia knows it. I mean, Marco Rubio knows it. He said this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Ukraine is the proxy. And Russia's winning this war. Russia's going to win this war decisively. What's in it for Russia? See, Russia says if you can end the war, if you want to fast track what we're going to get anyways, because we're getting everything we're asking for. We're not yielding on any of this because we're not losing. We're winning. So we're not going to back down on anything. If you want to help fast track this to bring this conflict to an end, maybe there's some things we can work out. We'd love to have normal diplomatic relations with you. We'd love to talk about, the economic benefits of normalcy. But when it comes to Ukraine, you don't get a vote. You don't have a say. And this is the lesson the Trump administration hasn't quite absorbed yet. Keith Kellogg doesn't get to come in out of nowhere and start drawing lines on a map and dictating outcomes and saying that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant has to be occupied by the. Who is the United States to come in and take over? It's as if the United States is now, instead of being a party to the conflict, is the benevolent, the good witch of the West, Glinda floating down in her little bubble, and she's going to touch things and make things all better again. No, the United States is the problem, not the solution. And so why would Russia be in a rush to do anything? There's no timeline for Russia. They don't care. And if that hasn't become obvious to everybody, I mean, they would, again, if the United States can pull it off, get the Ukrainians to agree to everything, get Europe to back down, Russia will sign on to that. Why not? But the idea that Russia is going to yield anything to the United States is absurd in the extreme. They will yield nothing. This was a conflict of existential proportions thrust upon them by Ukraine and the West, including Donald Trump's United States. And, Russia won the war. Anybody who doesn't think Russia's winning the war probably should never, ever again discuss geopolitical things or military things. Or, there's no one out there can articulate any plausible outcome from this conflict other than a decisive Russian victory. That's the direction we're heading. For Europe to try and put more resources into this will only further bankrupt Europe. And understand that the concept of a European security framework is a larger discussion, a larger dialogue that Russia has linked to this conflict. In fact, that was the first thing Russia wanted to talk about before going to war, is European security framework. Imagine if, NATO had said, yeah, we'd like to responsibly engage with you back in December of 2021. And we understand Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. We got that. What would have happened? Kherson, Zaporizhzhia would be Ukrainian. Donetsk and Lugansk would have had a referendum. Who knows what that outcome would have been, but it would have been an outcome that would not have cost any more lives. Hundreds of billions of dollars wouldn't have been wasted. Millions of lives wouldn't have been lost. And now you've got Europe scrambling to not even get to that. Whatever Europe's trying to retain, to hold on to, doesn't come close to what they would have gotten had they just sat down with the Russians in December of 2021. That's what the Russians have put on the table. And Russia's been pretty responsible ever since then. The Istanbul communique that created the potential for peace in March, April of 2022. Extraordinarily lenient for Ukraine, extraordinarily lenient, given what we know. I mean, people tend to forget that we're not just talking about a CIA-sponsored coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014 that thrust ultra-nationalists into power who were murdering Russians seeking to commit cultural genocide against the Russians that prompted this Russian uprising. We're not talking about just that. We're talking about the Minsk Accords, when Russia actually turned the tables on the Ukrainian army and had them in Donetsk surrounded, could have destroyed the Ukrainian army like that. And instead, Poroshenko went crying to the Germans and the French, who intervened through the Normandy process. And next thing you know, we have the Minsk Accords, where they begged Putin not to kill the Ukrainian army. And Putin said, okay, we'll choose peace. And that peace was a peace that recognized the 1991 borders minus Crimea. I'm sorry, Ukraine, you fumbled that one. You had it. Again, had you not, done the coup and sought to, eliminate the Russians, Crimea would still be part of Ukraine. Russia's not to blame for any of this. Russia didn't start any of this. Russia is reacting to impetus brought in by the West that was designed to bring harm to Russia, linked to an overall policy objective of bringing Russia down. People tend to forget that. Who was president in 2014? Barack Obama. Barack Obama back in 2009, 2010 sought the 2010 sought the reset, 2009, 2010, the reset. But the reset was regime change. In 2011, Barack Obama sent Joe Biden to Moscow to sit down with the Russian political opposition and threaten Putin. Don't you dare think about becoming president again. The outcome will be bad for Russia and be bad for you. People tend to forget this history, that the CIA was actively working to bring Putin down, to collapse the Russian government, to replace Putin with Medvedev, who they sought to take control of and make him a Yeltsin 2.0. Nobody talks about this reality, but the Russians know. The Russians know everything. They put everything in the proper perspective, a perspective that's lacking in the West. Donald Trump has been seeking to bring down Vladimir Putin. In the United States, has been seeking to bring down Vladimir Putin for decades now. And the Russians have said, we're not going gently into that good night. They're going to rage against the dying of the light, but they're not going to die. Russia has stood up on its own 2 feet. Russia has reconfigured its economy thanks to the stupidity of the West in the sanctioning. Again, everything that's happening today isn't because Russia said, oh, we're going to bring harm to the West. Everything, without exception, that's happening today is a reaction to the West not being responsible, including Russia's nuclear arsenal. I don't know how many times you have to listen to Vladimir Putin, talk at 2007 in the Munich Security Conference. Are you not aware of what you've done? We're not going to play this game anymore. The United States withdrawing from the ABM treaty. This is really not a smart idea, guys, because if you remove the ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile treaty, and you start to deploy anti-ballistic missile systems, we will need to create systems that can defeat that. And then I think it was 2018, he finally gave his speech where he said, these are the new weapons. Are you listening to me now? Do you remember that speech? Are you listening to me now? Because he'd been speaking till he was purple in the face saying, don't do this. This is not smart. We don't want to do this. We don't want to invest this money into doing this, but we have no choice because of what you have done. Everything Russia has done, without exception, that the West takes exception to today is because of the irresponsible policies of the West. So why would Russia ever suddenly now bend the knee? This is issues that have been brought to a head. This conflict is existential in nature. It's an extension of decades-long policies designed to bring the Russian government down. They're not bending the knee. They're standing up. And they will beat anybody that tries to bring them down. But Russia, again, is the only responsible party out there, because there is no talk in Russia about marching on Europe, taking over Europe. This is an absurdity, a European fiction, NATO fantasy. Russia's simply talking about defending Russia. And for those who say, well, they've carried out a war of aggression against Ukraine to seize their territory, re-examine the history. As I've said, had Ukraine and the West been serious about peace, Ukraine would be intact today, wouldn't have lost anything. Everything that's happened to Ukraine is because of decisions made by Ukrainian officials and their Western sponsors, their Western masters, that have sought to create the condition to bring harm to Russia. The fact that Russia isn't rolling over and playing dead, well, that just means that we didn't study Russia well enough.
Scott, you've mentioned something so amazing about Joe Biden going to Russia and talking if it's not good for Russia to consider Vladimir Putin again being the president of Russia. If someone does that to the United States, what could happen? Russiagate, there was nothing that they made a Russiagate out of nothing. And if there were something like that, what could have done? It's unbelievable.
Well, it's not just that, but let's put it in the proper context of Navalny. Navalny is a CIA-created resource. I mean, he's an ultra-right-wing lunatic who was basically brought into power. People need to study how Navalny came into being, because he's this nut job. I mean, he's a guy who literally, talks about, calling the people of the Caucasus cockroaches, and that the solution is to shoot them. Nice guy, Mr. Democracy here. But he was empowered because he could help create a youth movement that the West wanted to replicate what happened in Ukraine. The Orange Revolution was, again, a CIA, George Soros sponsored, coup to get rid of Viktor Yanukovych, who won the election, not once, but twice, but they illegally and unconstitutionally ran it a third time to keep him out, brought in Yushchenko, who's an ultra-nationalist. The first thing he did was make Stepan Bandera a national hero. People forget this. The Russians don't. But Navalny was supposed to replicate this. And the CIA backed him. He was brought to the United States. He was sponsored by this Russian academic who had this sort of a think tank type play, this salon that she ran in Moscow, where she brought in Gary Kasparov, another MI6 CIA resource, Nemtsov. The whole crew came in here, and she sponsored them and reported back to the U.S. Embassy because she was a CIA student. She was, I forget which universities she was working at here in the United States, Brown maybe or something, but she was recruited there, trained there, sent to Russia to do this job. She's now back here because she's a spy. She's literally a CIA resource. Navalny was CIA. The whole movement, democracy movement, was CIA controlled. They either did it directly through their officers in the U.S. Embassy, or they did it through proxies, through the NGOs. It's amazing. In 2012, when Russia kicked out USAID and all the other NGOs, everybody went, oh my God, how anti-democratic can you be? Today, who's saying that? We now know what the truth of USAID and NED and all these others are. We know what they do. Well, that's what they were doing. And the Russians went, not here. Goodbye, do svidaniya, so long, see you later, alligator. And they defunded this. But this isn't just what happened in that time frame. We have to go back to 1994 when, oh gosh, who was it? Michael McFaul. Again, do your research on McFaul, guys. Understand that he was part of that whole NGO-sponsored regime change thing. He was a Boris Yeltsin guy. He's the guy that helped create Boris Yeltsin, then sustain Boris Yeltsin. People tend to forget that this wonderful, expression of democracy in October of 1993 put tanks in the street to go to war against the Russian parliament, firing on the parliament to eliminate the parliament because he couldn't stand democracy. And we stood by and let it happen. And then we tried to cook up an election in the aftermath to create, a pro-Yeltsin wing, and we failed. And now that you continue this division. So in 1994, the charge d'affaires at the Moscow embassy, number 2 guy, I think last name was Mary. He wrote what's called the Long Telegram, the second Long Telegram. First one was George Kennan, 1946, I believe. This one, 1994. And he warned, he said, what we're doing is destroying the possibility of Russia developing genuine democratic institutions. We are destroying democracy in Russia by supporting Yeltsin and suppressing these institutions, which we did. And then in 1996, we bought the election. If you remember, Time Magazine ran a cover story about it, bragging about how best election money can buy. We bought Boris Yeltsin. And then, of course, in 1999, Mr. Corruption's about to collapse, and he turns the reins of power over to Putin. What did we do? We immediately turned around to try and take these institutions that we suppressed and we controlled and breathe new life into them and call them the political opposition. Putin, meanwhile, is saying, hey, I want an opposition. In 2004, I think he gave a presentation. He said, I'm all about political opposition, guys. I'm about Russia. I'm about Russia being Russia. And if you think I'm doing something wrong and you have better ideas, put them on the table. It makes Russia stronger. I'm for that. But he's not for the CIA hijacking that process to bring him down. That's not Russia being Russia. That's the CIA interfering. And so what happened is, after we destroyed these democratic institutions to create real Russian institutions, instead we replaced them with U.S.-controlled entities that sustained the Yeltsin government. When Yeltsin went away, we now took these U.S.-controlled entities and tried to transform them into Russian entities controlled by the United States to initially capture Putin, and when we couldn't capture Putin, to bring Putin down. We've been doing this game for so long that most Americans tend to forget that this is the reality. Americans today are saying, well, there is no real democratic institutions in Russia. Why? because we didn't allow it to happen. Don't blame it on Putin. What do you want Putin to do? Say, oh, it's okay. Let the CIA fund these people and come in. Yep, we're going to let the CIA come in and undermine that. We wouldn't let that happen here at all. So it's not just, Biden flying in there. Why did Biden think he could fly in there? What was going through his head? Because what he was is he was briefed by Michael McFaul and everybody else that we control the Russian opposition. That we never lost the 1990s mindset where we were in charge, where we were dictating, and we were resentful that this guy named Putin thought that he could control us. But after 2 terms, Putin had to step aside. Now Medvedev's in there, and we're convinced we can own Medvedev, that we can use the same control mechanisms that controlled Yeltsin. We can now latch them onto Medvedev and control him, but we got to keep Putin down. We got to put Putin out. We were literally talking about putting Putin to pasture. We were going to bribe, I forget what make him the head of the International Olympics Committee or something like that. Vladimir Putin was going to accept the bribe. Yep, just take the job, take the money, go get your sinecure, be the head of the Olympic Committee, and then we'll fly you around. You can be a talking head on TV, and yay. And Putin was like, you don't understand what the president of Russia means. See, Putin knows his job. His job was to save Russia from the West. And he did it, and the West is deeply resentful. And that's what this Ukraine conflict is about. It's an extension of this entire process designed to bring Russia down. The Ukraine conflict was bringing everything to a head. And we guessed wrong on everything. All the idiots that ran around and talked about the weakness of the Russia. Do you remember? I mean, it was very popular for a while. Russia's just it's a gas station. That's all it is, a gas station with nuclear weapons. That's all. Just a simple gas. Well, if Russia's a gas station, then the rest of the West is a Humvee out on a highway in the middle of nowhere with no gas. So suddenly the Russian gas station is the most important damn thing in the world. We got it all wrong. We guessed wrong about the Russian military, although I will say we just did Russia a huge favor. Again, though, sometimes the West, because people like me took a look at, I studied the Russian military, been studying it my entire life. And I saw the Russian military in 2008 going into Georgia, and I wasn't impressed. It was big, but it was cumbersome. It's, but what happened is the Russians also looked at that and said, we got to do better. They looked at the Georgians. The Georgians got their butts handed to it, but the Russians were watching Georgian light infantry, trained by the United States Marine Corps, by the way, maneuvering, communicating, maneuvering, tactically more proficient than their Russian counterparts. The Russians only beat them because they brought in a whole bunch of tanks, a whole bunch of artillery, and blew these poor guys off the map. But initially, these guys are moving, communicating, maneuvering, and the Russians couldn't do that. The Russians were like, what the hell is going on here? Because if the Georgians had the backing of NATO and tanks and all that, we'd be getting our asses handed to us. The Russians realized that. So they started rebuilding their military. And I watched them as they rebuilt. And I bought into the paper reports. I looked at the paper reports and I said, well, the Russians have learned their lesson. They're buying the new equipment. They're reconfiguring the military. What I didn't expect was the level of corruption that existed in the Russian military. And we're finding it today. I mean, these generals were using this new infusion of money to enrich themselves. When they talked about mobilization centers, they created these mobilization centers and they worked with the military commissars and everything to bring in the money. But instead of stocking up these places, many of them just pocketed the money and kept old stuff there because they said, there's never going to be a large ground war in Europe. We don't need to worry about this stuff. We're just going to pocket this stuff. Other general officers, the economy of a military in transition means that a lot of money is pushed down to these generals to do things, to get things accomplished, because it becomes not a conscript military, but a contract military. So money is out there and people were just pocketing money. Things that were supposed to be getting done weren't getting done. They were working with corrupt civilians. And so there was an expectation of a certain level of proficiency on the part of the Russian military that didn't happen when the Russians began military operations in 2022. The Russians still performed. The Russian military is very adaptive. Their officers learn quickly. It's probably the most adaptive military in the world. But the corruption mobilization, when Putin ordered 300,000 men to be mobilized, it was a cluster, you know what, for in certain areas. Guys were showing up. There's no uniform. Now they fixed it. They arrested people, and they're still arresting people. I don't know if you saw, they're arresting generals from the general staff to this day. People who were supposed to be building up the Kursk defenses, pocketing that money. And then the Ukrainians attack, and they're like, where are the things that are supposed to be here? The Russian military today is being purged of corruption. And the people that are replacing the corrupt officials that had dominated it for so many years are combat veterans, guys who have learned the cost of corruption and have zero tolerance for corruption. So this war has actually been a huge bonus for the Russians, because they've been able to break free the rust and the identify the problems, grease things up, replace parts, put parts in. They have a streamlined military today that is just a kick-ass machine, just a straight up kick-ass machine. Is it perfect? Nope. Nothing's perfect in this world. Is the Russian bureaucracy cumbersome? Oh yeah. It's less cumbersome today though than it was. And now when the Russians invest money into things, that money is being spent on what it needs to be spent on, because there's zero tolerance today for corruption in the military, not in the special military operation. Zero tolerance. And where it's identified, it's rooted out, they're arrested, etc. And so I guess Russia should thank the West, because we've actually turned them into a very, not just combat efficient group, but overall, we've improved the processes. We did the same thing in the economy. The economy was still, up until 2021, 2022, the oligarchs still had a big say in the economy. One of Russia's big problems was the inability, as businesses succeeded in Russia, as resources were, sold or consumed, money was taken out of Russia and not being reinvested into Russia. So whatever growth Russia was getting was being brought in by foreign investments, which further weakened Russian governmental control and influence over the economy. This was a problem for Vladimir Putin and his entire government. How to fix this? Well, they couldn't just divorce with the West. That would create political problems. Vladimir Putin was a 63, 65%, kind of guy at the polls. I mean, winning, but the margin there, if you get 20% of the people pissed off at you, like let's say you say, I'm going to unilaterally cut relations with the Western economies, that 20% goes to the opposition, and Vladimir Putin's not the president anymore. So he has to play this game. Out comes the special military operation, out comes the sanctions. And the first thing that the West does is sanction the oligarchs. And Putin's going, really? Thank you very much. We'll go along with that one. Y'all are out of here. Get out of here. You took your money away. Now the West took your money. That's a decision you made. We're done. And if you want to bring your money back in, the deal is now, since I get to call the shots, you have to invest everything into Russia. And that's what's happened is, these Russia has a very large economy, a very diverse economy that produces considerable income. But instead of that money, billions of dollars being taken out, it's being reinvested back in, which encourages more growth, which attracts foreign investors, not from the West, but from China, from India. Go to the St. Petersburg International Forum and take a look at the number of Chinese companies and Indian companies there. Also take a look at a number of Western companies on the wings going, we sort of can't wait to get back into this thing. Go to, Novosibirsk and take a look at the Chinese and Indian investment into the third largest city of Russia, the largest growing part of the Russian economic sector, Novosibirsk. Go to Ekaterinburg. Again, they have economic forums. Look at the list of Chinese and Indian companies investing into Russia. The Russian economy is just out of control in terms of growth and et cetera. Everything the West tries to do to strangle it backfires. And so the Russian economy is in a much stronger position today. And the reason why I'm bringing all this up is to say there's nothing the West can offer. To say, well, we'll lift sanctions. The rest are like, please don't. Please don't. We're doing quite well with the sanctions. You just keep them up. We'll keep growing. We like it because the sanctions create a firewall against the corruption that helped bring Russia down. Russia is like, let's call the corruption equivalent to a heroin addiction. Russia was addicted to the Western economic investments. And like any addict, you recognize this is bad for you, but you can't walk away from it. Man, they just made Russia go cold turkey. Russia's free of that addiction. No more shakes. Russia's got it figured out. They don't need the temptation of the West coming in. And it would be a betrayal of Russian companies. Russian companies step into the vacuum created by the withdrawal of the West to replicate what the Western companies were doing, especially in consumer-oriented goods, fashion, etc. And these companies are doing quite well. They're succeeding. Why is Russia now going to say, well, we're going to go ahead and bring back in the Western competitors to undermine what you've done? No, Russia's going to protect its industry, protect the Russians that have done well who were loyal to Russia, who didn't flee Russia, who stayed in Russia, built up new businesses. The West has nothing to offer Russia except this. If the West can accelerate the end of this conflict, Russian lives will be saved. That's the only thing Trump has, is to say, I can help you save lives. But you're talking about Russia, who in a couple of weeks is going to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany. They're going to have their Victory Day celebration. That's a day where they remember the 27 million dead. I just want to bring that number up one more time so people understand the scope and scale of what we're talking about. 27 million died in the ultimate existential struggle between the Russian version of good, which is them, and evil, which is Nazi Germany. We happened to agree with it at the time because we were their allies fighting against evil, Nazi Germany. The Russians understand that Mother Russia must be defended. And the vast majority of Russians today recognize that whatever they think about how this conflict started, I think a lot of Russians were confused. There was a group of Russians that, had bought into the West and were sort of sympathetic to the Western narrative, and maybe thought that the Russian propaganda was exaggerating what the West was doing in Ukraine and the danger of Ukrainian Nazism. There's a lot of, Ukrainian influence in Russia, and many people were saying that's exaggeration. We know in Ukraine today, the Nazis aren't in charge. It's, and so there's a lot of people saying, I don't know, man, I'm a little uncomfortable about this special military operation thing. Today, there's just no more debate about it. They know what Ukraine is. They know the evil that it is, and they know what the West has done. They've had the veil lifted from their face. They see clearly now. And they understand that this is an existential war. I already spent a lot of time talking about why it's existential, discovering the history. I'm not making this up. The Russians understand the existential nature of this conflict, which means that Russia must win, because to lose means it's the end of Russia. This isn't, like America withdrawing from Afghanistan. Oh, geez, it's inconvenient conflict. Let's just get out of Afghanistan. It's not America withdrawing from Vietnam. It's not America withdrawing from Iraq. If Russia loses this war, it's the end of Russia, because that is the goal of the people fighting Russia, to break Russia up into tiny little pieces, to bring it down, to strip it of its wealth, to keep it permanently subdued. And no Russian's going to go for that. As Putin has said, a world without Russia isn't a world worth living in, and nobody will be living in it. That's how serious this is. That's why I always tell people, you really want to defeat Russia, because if you do that, we all die. Because at the end of the day, the missiles get launched. But this is where we're at today, this existential struggle. The Russians are not going to yield on this. Would Russian mothers love it for their sons to come home? Yes. But my God, Russia's at the stage right now where the mothers are going back to World War II. I tell people, you can't ignore Russian history. You can't ignore Soviet history. Go to what was Stalingrad, today is Volgograd. Go to Mamiya Kurgai. Look at the motherland calls. Look at that statue of a Russian female gesturing forward towards the Nazis, calling her sons forward to go and fight the enemy. And then right beneath that, as you walk up, there's a pool, and there's a mother cradling the body of her dead son. He's dead. He died. She sacrificed him for the greater good. This is where the Russians are today. It's a mindset the West doesn't quite understand. Russian mothers are sending their sons off to fight and die in a war they view as existential. It's almost Spartan-like. Come home with your shield or on your shield. But you're going off to save the motherland, save Rodina, save, that which makes this all worth living. Save your family. This isn't a war of choice where the Russians are going, there's all this talk about the Russians going off for the money. Look, economic in an all volunteer force, a professional force, you have to pay your people. There's no doubt about that. But the Russians are volunteering. There's no shortage of troops. Even the West has to acknowledge that Russia can generate the kind of force mobilization just through the contract system without any additional mobilization. They can do this for years, that there's millions of Russians ready to come in and do this fighting, because this is about saving Russia from the West. That's what this war is about. And in the West, we don't get it. We continue to buy into the stupidity of this was, a war of territorial acquisition. No, it's not. Russians aren't going to die for territorial acquisition. Russians are going to die to defend the motherland. Mamayev Kagayev, the motherland calls. That's the Russian women of today. The wives send their husbands off. The mothers send their sons off. That's what's happening here. Unlike Ukraine, where they have to go around and thump people on the head and drag them out to go and fight in the front. Two totally different mindsets, which brings us back to Trump's peace plan. The Russians don't give a damn. They don't care. It's a joke to them. All this stuff about traveling around trying to convince people that the Russians have made it clear to Steve Witkoff what their terms are. And there's no yielding on that. Witkoff's going to go to Moscow. He's going to hear from the Russian government the same thing he's heard before. These are our terms. You can't bribe us. I mean, what's Witkoff going to? We'll give you Ukraine. Well, Steve, we got Ukraine. Well, maybe we'll talk about giving you the other four territories. Steve, we've got those. Well, maybe Steve, we got if we don't have it now, we're going to get it. That's just the way the cookie crumbles, man. So I don't think the Russians they don't give a damn. Look, Putin on Victory Day has invited President Xi of China, Modi of India. That's the big three right there. That's Putin, Xi, Modi together on Victory Day, celebrating this thing. This is a huge event. It's one of Marco Rubio should really be fired over this, because a good Secretary of State would have had a very major senior American delegation in Moscow for this event. That's what a good Secretary of State would have done. And if Marco Rubio's principles don't allow him to go because he's deep inside, he hates Putin and he hates Russia, we know he does. We know he does. We know he's sabotaging this whole thing. He's not on Team Trump. He's on Team Rubio. But there's no reason why J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth couldn't have gone together with a contingent from, pick an American division that fought in World War II that met with the Russians, and send a battalion of American soldiers, 500 strong, to march in formation, wearing their World War II uniforms, march down in Red Square as part of this procession, because, my God, at one time we stood side by side with these brave Russians and we defeated Nazi Germany. And we should have an American delegation there, and America should be proud of the 80th anniversary of this, and not making common cause with the Europeans who tend to forget, who've written the Russians out of the history books, where you have idiots talking about going to Kiev on May 9th. You know what's happening on May 9th in Kiev? The Russians in the ruins of this city were taking Nazis and hanging them by the neck in mass executions. And yet the Nazis are in power today in Kiev. And we're making common cause with them. It's an embarrassment. It's disgusting beyond belief. We belong in Moscow next to our true allies, the people that we once fought with to save the world from this scourge whose ugly face is reemerging in Europe as we speak. I mean, my God, we got the Germans talking about, sending more troops and equipment and stuff to the Ukrainian Nazis, as if they haven't learned their lesson.